I want to say a few words about my father and why I believe this weekend is so important. But don't worry.
The sound of church bells echoed faintly through the fog that morning, slow, measured, and heavy, as if London itself was holding its breath. It was October 9th, 2025, and what began as an ordinary autumn dawn soon turned into one of the darkest mornings in recent royal memory. Before the sun had fully risen, a pale-faced palace aide stepped to the podium outside Clarence House, clutching a single sheet of trembling paper. His voice cracked as he read the words no one had been prepared to hear. His Majesty the King has suffered a serious health complication overnight. The situation remains critical. Within moments, the nation seemed to stop moving. The hum of early traffic faded. Radios switched to breaking news bulletins, and candles began to appear at the gates of Buckingham Palace. Across the country, people stood in silence. Shopkeepers paused mid-task, commuters looked down at their phones, and tears welled quietly in the eyes of those who remembered another long night, not so many years ago when Britain lost its queen. But amid the sorrow, one detail pierced through the gloom. Prince William had personally ordered the release of the statement. It was a decision unprecedented in recent royal history, an heir taking command while the king still lived. His words, read later on camera, trembled with duty. "We are a family united in prayer and hope. My father remains under the care of his physicians. I ask the nation to keep him in their hearts." I'll admit, as I watched the footage replay on the evening news, there was something haunting in his eyes, not just grief, but resolve. The kind of resolve that only appears when a son feels the crown's weight long before it's placed on his head. And so, as the bells continued to toll across London, one question rose above the silence. What truly happened inside Clarence House before dawn? And why was William the one to speak first? Stay with me until the end, because what was whispered behind those locked doors may change how history remembers this family forever. To understand why that gray October morning struck Britain so deeply, we have to look beyond the breaking headlines to the months of quiet strain that had been building inside the monarchy long before the king's health collapsed. Behind the gilded gates, signs of exhaustion had been mounting for weeks. Courtiers whispered that the king had been working too relentlessly through his latest round of treatments, ignoring the gentle warnings of his doctors. He insisted on keeping his diary full state audiences, environmental briefings, and charity events, even as those close to him noticed his once firm voice softening into fatigue. It wasn't entirely unexpected. Earlier that year, in March 2025, the palace confirmed that Charles had experienced mild side effects from a scheduled medical procedure. Though it was officially described as temporary, insiders told the Telegraph that recovery had taken longer than expected. Yet the king, ever determined to prove his vigor, returned to work faster than his physicians advised. One aide later admitted, he didn't want anyone to think the crown was too heavy for him. Within the family, however, that determination was quietly becoming concern. Princess Anne, ever the pragmatist, reportedly urged her brother to delegate more. William, meanwhile, began attending private briefings traditionally reserved for the reigning monarch, an early indication that contingency planning was underway. And while the public saw the king smiling at garden parties and ribbon cuttings, those inside Clarence House described a man growing thinner, quieter, more introspective. Then came the subtle shifts, tiny, almost imperceptible details that signaled something was changing. A cancelled appearance here, a rescheduled audience there. Camilla's schedule was suddenly stripped of engagements without explanation. Aides avoided questions about her absence, saying only that Her Majesty requires rest. But palace correspondents noted a pattern. Wherever the king was, Camilla seemed increasingly not to be. Whispers began to circulate among journalists that a quiet tension had returned to the royal household. Some cited long-standing friction between Camilla and William over communication protocols. Others mentioned an unconfirmed memo, suggesting that William was to assume more oversight of the king's correspondence. None of it was officially acknowledged, of course, but these small cracks were becoming visible even to those who preferred not to see. And yet, amid the silence and speculation, there was still loyalty, especially from the public. Many Britons viewed the king's perseverance as admirable, Even noble, his lifelong dedication to environmental causes, his calm leadership during turbulent years, all of it painted the image of a monarch still deeply rooted in service. Perhaps that's why, when the news broke on October 9th, the collective grief felt so personal. It wasn't just a health crisis. It was the shattering of an illusion, the realization that even the most steadfast crown can tremble. I still remember watching the BBC anchor, eyes glassy, struggling to deliver the bulletin with composure. The footage of candlelight vigils from Cardiff to Edinburgh flashed on screen, while reporters speculated about the whereabouts of the royal family. One commentator said softly, "We may be witnessing a transition in slow motion." That line has stayed with me ever since, because behind the official statements and carefully worded reassurances, the transition had already begun. It wasn't formal, and it wasn't declared. It was happening quietly, organically, in the actions of a son stepping into the space his father could no longer fill. But while the world saw William's calm face on television, few realized how deep the tension ran inside those palace walls, or how that single day would expose the fragile alliances that had been holding the family together. In the days leading up to the king's health scare, the air inside Clarence House had grown strangely heavy, like a room filled with unspoken words. Staff members later recalled noticing subtle changes, the kind that only reveal their meaning in hindsight. The king's handwriting, once neat and measured, had become unsteady. He moved slower through the corridors, pausing often as if collecting his balance. And yet, when anyone asked if he was feeling well, he would simply smile, place a hand on their shoulder, and murmur, "Don't fuss, I've lived through worse." But the palace has its own language, coded silences, rearranged schedules, and discreet phone calls after midnight. On the evening of October 8th, an aide noticed that the king's private physician had been summoned unexpectedly. Soon after, the royal security detail quietly expanded around Clarence House, while the Queen Consort's car was seen leaving the gates without its usual escort. That, more than anything, unsettled those who watched. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the emergency line between the royal residences flickered to life. Doctors were called in. Senior aides were ordered to stand by. One witness later said the lights in the king's study stayed on until nearly dawn, a rare sight for the monarch who prided himself on routine. It was, by all accounts, the night Britain almost lost its king. When news of the crisis reached Kensington Palace, William reportedly ended a private dinner immediately. He was briefed by phone, his voice described as calm but clipped. "Keep it quiet," he said, "until we know he's stable." What struck insiders was how swiftly he took charge. Protocol demanded that any medical statement come through the king's office, but William overrode it. He ordered the palace press secretary to prepare an emergency bulletin, drafted personally by his communications team. It was the kind of decisive moment that future historians might look back on as the quiet start of a new reign. Meanwhile, the Queen Consort's absence was becoming impossible to ignore. For nearly 3 hours that night, her phone went unanswered. Rumors later claimed she had retreated to Raymil House, her private residence in Wiltshire, to gather her thoughts. Supporters called it an emotional reaction. Critics called it avoidance. Whichever it was, her silence created a vacuum, and William filled it. By sunrise, the first bulletin was ready. Cameras were set up at Clarence House. Journalists gathered under grey skies, and a sense of dread hung over London. When William's authorization came through at 6:05 a.m., it marked a turning point, not just for the family, but for the monarchy itself. The public's reaction was immediate. Polls taken later that morning showed 58% of Britons believed William should assume greater responsibility during the king's recovery. Social media erupted with support for him and Princess Catherine, whose quiet grace during recent months of family strain had made her an emblem of stability. One commenter wrote, "Maybe it's time the next generation takes the reins." Another simply said, "Duty runs in his blood." Watching it unfold, I couldn't help but wonder, was this the moment Britain subconsciously began to shift its loyalty? Was the torch passing not through ceremony, but through necessity? And now, I'd love to hear what you think. If you were living through this moment watching the heir step forward while the king lay ill, would you feel comforted or uneasy? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to share which country or city you're watching from. It's fascinating to see how this story reaches every corner of the world. Back inside Clarence House, as reporters broadcast the grim announcement, the atmosphere turned ghostly quiet. Doctors moved in and out of rooms with faces drawn tight. Aides whispered in corridors, their shoes muffled against the marble floors. Somewhere in the building, William's voice could be heard steady, calm, issuing instructions. Those who saw him that morning said he looked pale but resolute, his expression almost hauntingly familiar. One longtime aide whispered, "He has his mother's eyes, the same look she had when the world demanded strength she didn't know she had." As the sun rose over London, glinting against the palace gates, one truth was becoming clear. The kingdom was holding its breath. The king's health crisis had shaken the walls of tradition, and in the stillness that followed, everyone sensed that something far greater than medicine was at stake. When dawn broke over London, Clarence House no longer felt like a royal residence, it felt like a command center under siege. The curtains were drawn, security tightened, and only a handful of senior aides were allowed past the gates. Inside, the air was thick with unease, the kind that seeps through old walls when history begins to shift. Those who had served the king for decades said it was the quiet that terrified them most. No shouting, no commotion, just the muted shuffle of shoes and the occasional echo of a closing door. Behind those closed doors, a chain of decisions was already in motion. The Privy Council office had been contacted at 5:30 a.m., triggering a rarely used contingency framework known internally as continuity protocol. Under this plan, the heir to the throne assumes limited administrative oversight should the monarch become temporarily incapacitated. It had not been activated in over a century. The last time similar measures were even discussed was during the late Queen's final illness, but never this publicly, never this fast. In the drawing room upstairs, William met with the King's private secretary and the Lord Chamberlain. According to an insider present at that meeting, he listened in silence as updates came through from the medical team. The doctors reported that the King's condition was serious but stable, but there was concern about irregular heart function and prolonged unconsciousness during the night. One physician, voice tight with exhaustion, admitted that a relapse could prove critical. William reportedly closed his eyes for several seconds before responding. "We will do what he would want," he said quietly. Then he signed the paperwork authorizing temporary delegation of ceremonial duties. It was a signature that marked the first tangible transfer of authority between father and son. Elsewhere in the palace, Princess Anne had already arrived. She entered without fanfare, dressed in a dark overcoat, face pale but composed. Witnesses described her as all business, a soldier's daughter confronting another crisis. She was briefed privately by William before requesting to see her brother. Doctors refused, saying the king was sedated and not yet coherent. For the first time in decades, Anne reportedly wept in silence. Meanwhile, the queen consort's absence had become the subject of frantic speculation. By mid-morning, several news outlets had picked up rumors that she had left London altogether the night before. Her staff insisted she had merely gone to her private quarters within Clarence House, but insiders whispered that her personal car had been tracked heading toward Highgrove, the king's countryside retreat. Hours after the emergency began, the palace press office refused to comment, but one aide privately told The Guardian that Her Majesty was deeply distressed and needed space. That space created a leadership vacuum at the very moment when clarity was needed most. Aides loyal to Camilla hesitated to brief William directly, unsure of protocol. Messages went unanswered. Meetings were missed. For a few tense hours, the heart of the monarchy operated on instinct rather than structure. Downstairs, in a smaller conference room, the king's most trusted private advisor, a man who had served him since his days as Prince of Wales, met quietly with Princess Anne. He carried with him a red leather folder marked Personal Archive Directive. Inside, according to one later account, was a sealed letter written by the king in 1998, his private reflections and instructions for the monarchy in the event he became unable to perform his duties. The letter had been rumored for years, but few believed it actually existed. Anne reportedly stared at the folder for a long time before speaking. "Not yet," she said. "We pray first." The advisor nodded, but as he left the room, the weight of that folder was unmistakable. Somewhere in the building, another aide was already whispering that the letter's content might change everything. By late morning, the cabinet office had been briefed discreetly. Government officials began drafting scenarios for potential regency arrangements should the king's condition deteriorate further. The prime minister was informed, though the discussion was kept confidential. Constitutional lawyers were summoned to Downing Street to review the line of succession in light of temporary incapacitation. One political commentator described it later as the day Britain rehearsed for the unimaginable. Through it all, William remained composed. He met briefly with Anne, then with senior staff. His instructions were concise. No panic, no speculation, and no leaks. But of course, leaks were inevitable. By noon, reporters from the Times had confirmed that William was now chairing briefings once reserved for the monarch. On social media, headlines began appearing. Prince in control, heir steps forward, shadow of transition. Inside Clarence House, the king's doctors moved quietly between rooms, updating charts and monitoring vital signs. At one point, a nurse found William standing alone outside his father's chamber, looking through the half-open door. The rhythmic beeping of machines filled the silence. He didn't speak, didn't cry, just watched. His reflection caught in the glass, a prince already carrying the burden of kingship. Elsewhere, aides reported that the queen consort had finally returned by afternoon, pale and visibly shaken. Her eyes were swollen, her voice soft. She asked to see the king, and though the doctors permitted only a few minutes, those who stood nearby said she clasped his hand and whispered something they couldn't hear. One witness later told Sky News, "It wasn't the voice of a queen, it was the voice of a wife who was afraid." As night fell again over London, Clarence House remained sealed from the outside world. The lights in the king's study burned late, a dim glow visible from the street. Inside, decisions were still being made, alliances shifting quietly, loyalties tested. The monarchy, built on ceremony and tradition, was now surviving on whispers and willpower. And somewhere deep within those walls, that red folder still rested, its contents untouched, but looming like a shadow over everything that came next. By the next morning, October 9th, London woke to an avalanche of headlines that no palace statement could control. What had begun as cautious whispers the night before had exploded into a national reckoning. Crown in crisis, read the front page of The Guardian. Prince William steps up amid fears for the king, echoed the Times. The BBC interrupted its regular programming to air live updates from outside Clarence House, where cameras now stood like sentinels under the grey autumn sky. The palace's silence only fueled the frenzy. By midday, a crowd had gathered behind the black railings, mothers with prams, pensioners in scarves, tourists holding phones aloft. Someone began to sing "God Save the King," but the words wavered, uncertain. In that moment, it wasn't devotion the people felt, it was dread. Britain had seen this before. The quiet dread of waiting for a royal curtain to fall. Social media, meanwhile, had erupted into chaos. The hashtag King Charles Health Scare trended in more than 20 countries. In Canada and Australia, live feeds carried non-stop coverage. Commentators speculated whether the Commonwealth might face another period of constitutional drift. By early afternoon, an unofficial poll showed that 65% of Britons supported William, assuming greater duties immediately. One American outlet put it more bluntly, "The world is watching the Windsors in slow transition." Inside the palace, however, things were anything but slow. After hours of uncertainty, the royal press office was finally instructed to prepare a televised address. The order didn't come from the king or his doctors, it came from William himself. Those close to the situation later said he delivered the command without hesitation, his tone calm but firm. "If we do not speak, others will." At 4 p.m., the cameras went live. William appeared before a muted backdrop at Clarence House, his tie black, his expression controlled but deeply human. His voice, measured and low, carried across the nation. "My father remains under medical supervision. We are hopeful, and he continues to receive the best possible care. In the meantime, we will honor his dedication by carrying forward his work." The words were simple, but their weight was immense. For many, it sounded less like reassurance and more like an unofficial declaration that the king's son had quietly stepped into his place. I remember watching that moment live, feeling the collective pulse of the country shift. There was pride, yes, but also unease. It was as though the monarchy had exhaled too soon, unsure who truly led its breath. Outside, reporters pressed forward as Anne arrived in a navy coat, her face set in the kind of stoic resolve that has always made her Britain's unspoken backbone. She joined William for a private meeting that lasted nearly an hour. When they emerged, a short written statement was distributed to the press. "The family is united in strength and hope." No mention of the Queen Consort, no detail about the king's condition, just those carefully chosen words, family and united, echoing across every broadcast. But even unity has fractures. By evening, an anonymous insider leaked that Camilla had objected to William's unilateral actions, claiming she was being cut out of decisions regarding her husband's care. Her aides scrambled to deny the report, but the damage was done. Pundits filled the airwaves with talk of a power struggle within the crown. Royal biographers dissected every glance, every silence, every old feud between the Queen Consort and the heir apparent. That night, the public gathered again outside the gates, candles flickering in the rain. It was a scene eerily reminiscent of another royal vigil decades earlier, when the nation grieved Diana. People prayed, others simply stood still, gazing at the palace windows where lights still burned behind the curtains. Some whispered that they saw movement, a silhouette at the window, perhaps William's watching the crowd below. The emotional weight of the moment rippled far beyond London. Across Europe, church bells rang in solidarity. In Washington, the White House released a statement expressing deep concern, and inside Clarence House, however, that endurance was faltering. Aides moved like shadows, the king's condition uncertain, the future unclear. And amid the candlelight and speculation, one truth was becoming impossible to deny, whether by accident or inevitability. The line between king and successor had blurred. When the cameras were finally packed away and the reporters drifted into the mist, the real reckoning began. The palace, once synonymous with control, had become a living organism of rumor and reaction. Every corridor at Clarence House buzzed with whispers, some fearful, others opportunistic. Staffers who had served through decades of royal calm admitted privately that they had never seen the monarchy so fragile, so exposed. The first ripple came from the outside world. By dawn on October 10th, headlines across Europe and North America were unanimous. William takes charge amid crisis. Newspapers printed side-by-side photographs of father and son, one frail in hospital, the other stoic before the cameras. The contrast was powerful, almost prophetic. In Britain, morning talk shows debated whether the heir had overstepped. On social media, the verdict was clearer. Polls now showed 72% public confidence in William's ability to lead the monarchy through the uncertain months ahead. Inside government circles, the shift did not go unnoticed. The Cabinet Office quietly reviewed legal options under the Regency Acts, a precaution that hadn't been discussed since the Queen Mother's Day. Senior ministers urged restraint, but constitutional advisors confirmed what everyone already knew: if the king remained incapacitated for more than 90 days, formal delegation of powers would be required. The mere mention of that possibility sent tremors through Parliament. Meanwhile, the Queen Consort's absence from public life had become a headline of its own. Commentators pointed to the now famous photograph of her entering Clarence House through a side door, eyes hidden behind dark glasses, avoiding the cameras. For supporters, it was dignity in grief. For critics, it was isolation turned into weakness. In a monarchy built on optics, absence becomes its own statement. And yet, amid the noise, there were still those trying to hold the family together. Princess Anne, ever the quiet enforcer, began serving as mediator between William's camp and Camilla's. She spent hours moving between their private offices, trying to keep communication alive. Insiders later described her as the last bridge standing. Her loyalty was to the institution first, not the individuals within it. She reminded everyone that stability, not sympathy, was the monarchy's true inheritance. As the days passed, global reaction grew more intense. Commonwealth nations, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand issued coordinated messages of support, but also subtle reminders of independent constitutional pathways. In other words, they were watching closely. American networks hosted marathon broadcasts dissecting royal succession law. France's Le Monde compared the moment to the quiet transfer of power from Louis XV to Louis XVI, but without a coronation. At home, the public response was raw and emotional. Vigils continued nightly outside Buckingham Palace. Crowds held up photographs of both Charles and William, candles reflecting on the wet pavement. One handwritten sign read, "For the King's health, for the Crown's future." It captured the national paradox, perfectly mourning the man while embracing the inevitable shift. Through it all, William maintained his silence. He made no new appearances, issued no further statements. His advisors described him as focused, calm, and unshaken. Camilla, on the other hand, released a brief message thanking the nation for its compassion. It was polite, but distant her name, trending online not for sympathy, but speculation. By the end of that week, even the most loyal courtiers understood what was unfolding. The monarchy was no longer waiting for time to decide. Time had already chosen. Behind the heavy doors of Clarence House, William was running the meetings, signing the authorizations, fielding the calls. Camilla's role was ceremonial at best, her influence quietly receding. And somewhere in the background, unconfirmed, unacknowledged talk began again of the king's sealed letter, the one said to define his wishes should he ever become too weak to rule. It had resurfaced once before in private conversation, but now, aides whispered, it was being read aloud to select officials. If true, it meant one thing only: the crown was already in motion. As the sun set over London on October 11th, 2025, the lights around Clarence House glowed softly against the darkening sky. Behind those walls, the monarchy that had once seemed unshakable now stood at a crossroads between past and future, between duty and change. The king's condition remained uncertain, but the deeper tremor was emotional, not medical. Britain was not just worrying for a man, it was quietly preparing for the end of an era. For centuries, the crown has symbolized endurance, a reminder that institutions outlive individuals. But this moment revealed something often forgotten. Power is fragile when compassion is missing. Watching William step forward with calm resolve while the nation prayed reminded everyone that leadership, at its best, is born not from ambition, but from responsibility. I couldn't help reflecting on it myself. No throne, no title, no tradition can survive without empathy to steady it. The monarchy's future, like any family's, depends on how its members face crisis together, not apart. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson in all of this. Behind the grandeur of royalty are people imperfect, vulnerable, and human. Their pain mirrors our own. Their choices echo the ones we make in smaller ways every day. How we shoulder duty, how we forgive, how we hold faith when the lights flicker. If there is a silver lining to this storm, it's that it reminds us what truly endures is not crowns or palaces, but courage and compassion. Yet even as the nation takes comfort in that thought, a question remains: what happens if the king never fully returns to the throne? The sealed letter, the whispered plans, the shifting loyalties, these are not just stories, they are history in motion. If you found this story meaningful, give this video a like to help others see it too. Share your thoughts in the comments. How do you feel watching this chapter unfold? And which country or city are you watching from tonight? Don't forget to subscribe, because the next royal revelation may arrive sooner than anyone expects.